Brand or performance, long-term or short-term? These are the competing priorities that many marketers are facing. With so many stakeholders and so many objectives to hit, it's no wonder that there's been this false narrative that you've got to choose. Everyone wants their priority at the front of the line. But what if there was a different way? My guest today is Tariq Hassan, who's been both a CMO and a CXO, sometimes at the same time, at companies like McDonald's and Petco. I'm Laura Jones, and this is Opinion Party, the podcast where we dispel the most pervasive myths in modern marketing. Welcome to the party, Tariq.
Thanks. You broke down the first myth, which is how to pronounce my name. It's Tariq. Thank you. People often don't get it right, so I appreciate it.
Well, I can't promise you there aren't a few on the blooper reel. So as I was doing some background research and, Google stalking you and all that, I saw on LinkedIn a post you just made that really caught my eye. And you said, beyond the boardroom, committing my time to impacting the lives of others has always been my true north. And when I read that, I just really felt seen, because in a sea of AI-generated content on LinkedIn right now, that just felt really true and authentic. Tell me a little bit more about your philosophy on that.
Look, I think I've been fortunate enough to work on some incredible brands, work with some incredible teams, have some incredible successes. And so as you move through your career, for me personally, I start to look for different benchmarks, right, than the traditional success KPIs. Don't get me wrong, the business ones are all really critical, but I'm in a place in my life now where my value is going to be derived from things that are a lot more grounded, a lot more organic, a lot more, dare I say, when I'm not in the business anymore, what have I done for others? And for me, that's driven by my own personal Ikigai, which I follow very closely. And the headline for that's really simple. My focus is on helping exceptional people achieve extraordinary things. And that's, to me, at this point in my life, that's the best value. And I think when you do that as a business leader, you not only get the return on that individual, which I think is the greatest gift and responsibility of as leaders, but that shows up in the return of the business. And so that's, for me, my true north.
I love that you brought up the Japanese concept of Ikigai. That's a big hallmark of the Institute for Real Growth, IRG. For those audience members who aren't sure what that is, how do you describe that?
And it is a hallmark. And in fact, I discovered it going through my own IRG experience, and I'm now on the third iteration of mine, because it's really about helping you find your true north. And that true north defined by things that I think we in business don't often focus enough on, which are, what are the things we're actually passionate about? What are the things we're actually really good at? What does the world actually need? And how can you actually create a sustainable living and value doing those things? And that's a pretty simplistic thing, but it's a complex thing to sit down and face yourself and be subjective and really self-evaluate yourself to distill that down into a way that you can then act on it. And so for me, it's incredibly powerful, because it becomes the true north of not only what I do as a leader, but it also helps me make decisions on what I'm doing in my own career, and both as a business leader, but as a dad and as a partner, and those kind of elements as well.
Now, a lot of people say it's really difficult to write down purpose, and the excuse I hear, and I'll call it an excuse because we all have them, right, is time. I'm so busy, I don't have time to do this. But once you peel that back a little bit, oftentimes there's something underneath that is also holding us back. Did you experience any resistance or any sort of moment where you had to break through that to really sit down and put that down? Or is this something that has always just been natural and a part of who you are?
By no means natural. I mean, if I look back over my career, if I had any wishes, I wish I'd had some mentors earlier, because I think that those mentorships and those personal boards that you develop actually help you form those kind of things. If I'm honest, I think going through the IRG experience in COVID, that intersection of being locked down and still striving to find that connection, and I am inherently a very social, extroverted individual. I find my energy in that space. I think it intersected at a time when I was trying to figure out not only what would the world look like after this, but frankly, what would I look like after this? And so I think I was incredibly open to it. I think I'd been open to it, but I didn't have a construct, and that construct helped me. It helped me sort of sort through things. I think most of us have that construct of understanding of what our purpose is, and when we don't really truly want to spend time on it, it's generally because we're in conflict with trying to figure out those things. And that's not a bad thing. I'm a big believer you don't get to greatness without great creative tension, and that extends to yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned your role both as a partner and as a caregiver. You said you've got a daughter, and tell me about how, I love that you brought up your family so early, because it really tells me that you're bringing everything to this. I'm a mom. I've got 2 little girls. They're 10 and 12. And so how do you think about your full life in the context of what you bring into work, and then how you bring all of the other things that are important to you outside as part of yourself?
Yeah, look, I think I grew up in an era pre this notion of what does it look like to bring your full self to work, pre the notion of the role of vulnerability. And I struggled with that not being as present in the workplace. And so when those kind of conversations started to take place, and being fortunate enough to sort of be a little more senior in my career to be able to create space for and safe space for my teams around, it's something I leapt in heartily to. For me, that moment though, and you referenced my daughter, who happens to be one of my absolute superheroes, that for me became very real. She was 4.5 when she was diagnosed with a very rare form of renal cancer. And thankfully, great experience in terms of where she ended up. And she's in a great place, healthy, amazing young woman today. But I learned a ton in that process, right? That the process of reminding yourself of what children do in points of challenge, which is they stay focused on being a kid, and the lens that they see complexity through to simplify in order for them to continue to be a kid. So I learned a lot from her in that process. And so not only what I had to do to marshal her as a father, but frankly, that experience, what it did for me, leaving it on what kind of leader I wanted to continue to be. And frankly, an absolute refusal after the last couple of roles to not be anything but in a position to bring that bring my whole full self, but more importantly, leverage my senior leadership to be able to open that up for others, for my entire team, and how to do that. And it's still a work in progress, I think, in corporate America for us to figure out how to embrace that and allow our teams do those things.
Yeah. What do you think are just some of the barriers for people not being able to do that, or doing that and then maybe facing a backlash?
Look, I don't know. I don't know if I'd say it's backlash as much as, in order for you to have that kind of vulnerability in your culture, you have to create a really safe environment, right? And you have to allow for and develop that trust with your teams to do that. I think some of that is, and maybe this is me reflecting my age, but I think some of that is impeded by moving into a virtual hybrid world. I think there's some inherently accelerated relationship elements that happen in person. But I also think that the generation that's following in many ways demands that kind of authenticity and that kind of vulnerability. And unfortunately, quite often you don't find out that they don't feel it until after they leave, right? And so I start to lean in and I'm a big believer of having people mentor up to you. And I've learned a lot from the folks on my team. It took a while. The initial phase was like, wow, we weren't really quite sure how to understand that. That's very different than how most executives show up. They were almost suspect of it. And then as you get into it and people become more comfortable of it, it then becomes a trademark of your potential relationship with your teams. And I know what the outcome can be when teams are unlocked to do that. And the work shows what we've been able to do as a result of that.
You bring up a great point, which is reverse mentoring, and how in some ways it does bring up a sense of vulnerability, right, in ourselves as leaders, and sometimes admitting we don't know how to do something, or technology is changing faster, and there's people that were born as digital natives and are really on top of it. But I agree, having that reverse flow of information can be so fulfilling and is really mutually beneficial. And that brings us to our next point, which is, again, another hallmark of the IRG program, which is all about creating value for multiple stakeholders in an organization. And so what's been your approach to creating stakeholder value? You've had a lot of different competing priorities. We'll get to talking about the push and pull of the short term and the long term in a minute. But how do you think about creating value for all stakeholders?
Well, look, I think the first thing is that as marketing leaders, we have to start with making sure we have a depth of understanding of the business and what are the priorities of the business. And that's where that tension around the conversation of brand and performance is an irrelevant one to me, because everything that we do, should always support what the brand needs to do, and it should always support the commercial efforts of a company. And I think those things can absolutely coexist, and they must coexist, because you become unauthentic very quickly when those things are not true. I don't think the prioritization question is just simply a marketing question. I think organizations are challenged to think about what are their true priorities that they need to function on. And in many cases, are you spending time to really prioritize the elements that actually have commercial value? And that's where I think time duration comes in. Because I do think you have to look at some of those short-term commercial values, and those are still relevant, but you can't leave everything off the table just because it seems to be long-term value, because there is an interrelationship between those. By the time you decide to get to some of those elements of enduring value for a brand or a business, we've seen that movie. We know what happens when companies try to overfixate on just pure acquisition. And then all of a sudden, when the brand matters, you haven't built one, right? And so that's why I firmly believe those things can coexist. And I think that's the job of marketers. We've always had the job of taking complexity and boiling it down to simplicity. We don't get to wake up tomorrow and say, but it's too complex today to do that, because those same elements of complexity are also creating massive opportunities for us to be smarter, to have deeper insight, to be able to engage with our customers in a more personal and customized way. So I'll take all the complexity that's coming with it, but it doesn't let us off the hook for continuing to try to distill that down and make sure we prioritize properly and connect with them.
So you seem to be an excellent storyteller. Just sitting here, I know that you have likely a very great narrative around all sorts of stakeholders. What would you say to those stakeholders in an organization that are very short-term focused? How would you have those conversations with them, especially working for public companies, et cetera, in some ways, maybe convincing them or helping to make the business case for investing in the long term as well in brand?
Look, my first place I'd start with is if you're convincing them, you're already too late. You've got to start on the front end of this. This is not a marketing domain question. This is about understanding. Again, this goes back to, do you have a clear understanding what the goals and objectives of the business are? As a marketer, do we know what the drivers of the revenue to meet those goals are going to be? Because they're not always in the levers that we pull in marketing. And I need to understand those. And in the same way, I need to make sure that my partners understand what the levers that I want to pull in marketing do. That needs to happen to the front end. That needs to happen when you're thinking about the plan. That needs to be happening when you're thinking about the distribution of your budgets for the year. And then you have to be accountable and sign up for what you're going to do on delivery, which means the measurement has to be in place. And when you don't have perfect science on those, it means you have to come up with a system that gives you something into it. But you can't be the only one conversing this. Right? You have to be able to have that relation with a CFO that understands and is actually part of the vision and development. And, depending on the business you're in, your head of operations is critical, because the things we do as marketing can have massive implications on the experience, which is why in my last two roles, that interrelationship between marketing and customer experience is so critical. Just because marketing has an ownership of the customer, we have an accountability to what that looks like across the business, which has to be cross-functional in the way that you work with your partners to do it. So I don't find myself very often in places of convincing. I find myself in a place where I want to make sure we've established what is the question and the objective and the goal we're trying to achieve, and that my partners are signed up and understand that question and goal before we start leaving. And then I want to leave together with them, right?
Yes, that cross C-suite collaboration is so important with the CFO, with even the CHRO, all of the different members. And back to your earlier point about just the boardroom and just making sure that everyone's aligned and on the same page, that definitely is something that resonates, I think, with a lot of marketers today. But a lot of marketers still struggle. And so what is your advice for those marketers if they're finding themselves in a situation? I've heard someone say you can either love it, leave it, or change it. What's your advice to those people?
I think our job as marketers is to manage audiences. Those audiences extend to the internal organization. And so when you have, first of all, a depth of understanding what is the mission for the brand and the mission for the business, and it's universally understood, and then you have clean priorities, that's not easy. I get it. But you got to get down to what those priorities are and have alignment around those. And then it's, like I said, we used to be able to work in much more of a situation of marketing's been briefed and they'll be back with a great answer, and it's been across a handful of channels, right? That's not where we live today. In fact, some of the most significant revenue driving factors on certain businesses aren't necessarily the outward levers that we pull in marketing. They're things that are much closer to the transaction itself. And so that cleanness is gone. And so I would say manage your audiences. But if you have a clean view to your external customer audience and you have a foggy view to your internal cross-functional audiences, that's not a great situation to be in. And it's a hard place to live, even when you're being successful. And it's not a very rewarding situation for your teams.
Definitely. You mentioned metrics, and I know one of your signatures and your expertises are setting up decision-making engines. And we often find a lot of the people that I talk to have way too much data, way too much information. They don't need any more. They actually need something that's going to drive better, bolder, more confident choices. And what has been your secret to just getting in place a decision-making engine and hitting the ground running with that?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. And it starts with, we do have both the gift and the pain of the amount of data that we have. The organization of how you use that data goes back to the theme we've already talked about, which is, what are your priorities, right? And there's a variant in there. It starts with, what are you measuring? Just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should measure it. What's its objective? What are you leveraging it for? And then the inverse is true. Just because you have the data doesn't mean you should always act on it either, right? Just because the data gives you the ability to understand something doesn't mean you should move forward. Again, go back to those priorities. What are you trying to drive? And then I think the other part of it is, we used to get bored of our own things before because we didn't have enough data to tell us if it was working. Now we find ourselves at times getting bored because I have new data that tells me to do yet another thing, and so we want to move on to those things. That's the other part that I think is really critical is, do you have the right strategy and insights in place? And if you're finding success on those, are you moving the tactic? That's okay. To a different version of that. Or are you moving your whole strategy? And I think at times we're too quick to want to shift the strategy before we're even done. When you basically have lightning in a bottle, if it's working, maybe you just need a different articulation of it. And so I think it goes back to, get your data organized. And when I say organized around what the success outcomes of the business, which means you have to really spend time further upstream asking yourself how that data should be set up in the first place, right? What are you trying to achieve? Once you have those things in place, I like to strive for what I used to tell my team. I'd like striving for getting to a place where boring is really beautiful. If your strategy is just rinse and repeat because it's working, and where you then spend your time is just finding ways to make it interesting and exciting in the way you execute it, that's a great place for a marketing organization to be. Bored with the strategy, focused on creating excitement on how to take it to market.
You are so right. Marketing has always been guilty of having a short attention span. I myself have worked on the MasterCard Priceless campaign, and at the time they were 10 years in, and it was just such a unique place to be in the industry because sticking with one idea, and that in some ways was not just a campaign, it was an overall approach, a strategy. And in some ways it goes with the territory, right? Because the marketers were focusing on innovation, but that is really great advice.
I think the last part of it is, you have to resist creation for the sake of creation's sake. A platform like Priceless gave you lots of room to grow and develop things. Sometimes we come in and we think because we're new to something, we have to put our mark on it by doing something new. Maybe the goal is to actually extend the quality of what's working in a really new, interesting way.
Yeah, that's fundamentally what building relationships is all about, right? Consistency, investing, and going deeper and deeper.
Yep.
So you talked about boring is beautiful, but you also talk about the concept of swagger and how there's a certain balancing act of balancing swagger and performance marketing. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I just think that when we were starting to learn how to leverage the Internet of Things, and we were starting to learn how to use the exhaust that was data to actually turn into a commerce conversation, using that data initially to find those audiences and drive transactions like we were seeing in direct-to-consumer businesses looked like the promised land. Until either someone else enters the category with you and it creates the question of why you, that's inherently a brand question. That's no longer a cost of acquisition question. Today, the separation between what we used to think about in that linear world and it's blurred and it's gone. I'm now managing data signals, not geographies. I'm now managing my understanding of that customer. And increasingly with the work that I'm doing in AI right now, I'm not only figuring out who they are, but the AI is starting to help me with the when they're going to behave a certain ways. And so if I'm going to get you to act, I have a choice. I can continue to pile on to the trade aspects and offer aspects of acquisition, or I can create value around that same acquisition relationship in a way that not only gets you to engage on the transaction, but engage in your heart and potentially invest in this business and this brand. We started doing certain things like that on McDonald's where, for example, team had an audacious goal to put 2 million new users on the app in a month. It was massive. We could have done the back of the napkin. What would it cost to spend how much to acquire those customers and go to town and just buy them? Instead, what the team did was built a platform around summer camp. It was summer season. through the lens of what it's like to experience sort of all those memories you have around summer camp. Made Kid Cudi the official camp director, and then great food innovation, great offers, great merchandise, and then a concert in the app every Saturday for the month of July that you could only access until you went in. At the end of that month, and I always believe customers, like no customer walks around asking to be acquired, right? No human wants to be bought. And so instead, I think at the end of the month, if you'd had that conversation with those customers, they wouldn't have said, I received an offer from McDonald's that led me to download the app. They would have said, I had this a great experience with McDonald's, and whether it was the food or the merch, I got to see this concert that I couldn't have done unless that's an experience. It still achieved the transaction. It still achieved the performance. And yes, the team hit their goal. And so I don't believe you have to make separations on these. I think that the brand increasingly, because of how savvy customers are with data and the fact they know we know them, you better show up in a way there's value for that customer and that there's an authenticity and personalization that they can appreciate.
Super fun, that idea, really. I remember back in the day, the Monopoly and having all the fun, and I love to see that the brand really keeps that childlike wonder alive, even with adults and evolving and being culturally relevant. And so you've been a CMO and a CXO, and those two, depending on the organization, those two roles can either be very closely aligned or very separate. And the measurement of those two things has kind of come from two different places. How have you successfully looked at measurement through the lens of both of those roles? And have you found a way to really organize it in a place that leads to growth for one and the other?
Yeah, look, it's challenging because the outcomes of how you drive, what you define as success can also be very, very different, right? Sometimes the experience model, and it was certainly the case at Petco and in many ways the case at McDonald's, the initial success metrics aren't necessarily transactional customer metrics. The initial success metrics are, have you simplified the workflow for your teams? Are they able to show up with the customer in a different way? At Petco, putting data in our hands that allowed me to know, are you a cat owner or a dog owner? Even though the pet's name, know some historical information on your pet, that's a very different experience than we had prior to that information not being in the hands of people in stores who are amazingly passionate about animals and they want that relationship with their customer. Yes, that's inherently a marketing outcome, but that's not measured inherently by just specific transactions. That's in relationship to key brand metrics around customer satisfaction, trust, relationship with brand, but increasingly metrics with your company people, right? And loyalty and desire to stay, a company I want to continue to work for. And so again, it goes back to what are the goals you're setting? What are the role that you have to achieve in terms of the marketing dollars you're spending? What's the goal of what you're trying to achieve with the experience? And then yes, there's overlap. And how do you think about the overlap of those things are? And again, that's increasingly why you have to bring cross-functional teams together to do this work, because they don't work in a silo. I've been fortunate in the sense that I was there at starting of doing some of this work. And so when you're designing it, it's much easier than trying to adjust the legacy models that maybe have deficiencies in them. And I was fortunate enough to work in cultures where going at it cross-functionally was incredibly supportive. And there was unified point of view from a leadership that those were the right things for us to do. And I don't really see the role as two roles of CMO, CXO, other than we call them those things. I think at the end of the day, marketers have always been accountable for understanding the customer in an intimate fashion. The only difference is the implications of where that customer now connects with us extends well beyond the external elements they used to when we were doing this years ago. Today, the implication they have on everything from an operational experience, from a product development experience, it's omnipresent, right? So it's not only channels that are omnichannel, so are our customers. And so you have to think that way as a leader.
And Petco, I love that you brought that up. I have a puppy that we just got. Her name is Casey, and I'm now its first puppy. I'm in the world of getting things sent with Casey's name on them.
You are a pet parent.
All the pet parent things. It's almost like when I was having my kids and they say, oh, Casey is 16 weeks old today. And you mentioned using AI as something that you've been using at brands. Where do you feel the line is in between personalization as a strategy within customer experience and creepiness?
Well, I think the first place is where do you apply it as a company first and foremost, right? And my initial, like my most recent experience in the fast food service world was the application of AI, not so much for marketing execution, but actually rather operational. The ability to help our crew understand what traffic flow might start to look like and change. The first significant pilot we did from a marketing perspective was in offer management, where I could actually understand, are you planning on coming out today for a meal? Is customer B coming but already coming to McDonald's? And is customer C going to go but they're going to a competitor? We were able to look at algorithms that could give us a day part focus and know that that happens with you on Tuesday, but not on Wednesday, Thursday. And so we were able to suppress money we were spending. It's the old Wanamaker rule, right? I know I'm wasting half my money. I just don't know which half. This is starting to help us understand that. So if I know you're not coming, why am I spending money? So very much operational in terms of where we were starting to think about AI. I think as you increasingly start to know the customer, you have to listen to them and understand where they see value. Value will determine how much I'll allow you to be personalized with me, right? If I don't see value, then that's where the creepy, I think, kicks in. Customers have demonstrated today, they kind of know you have their data. Treat it with respect, treat it with value. And if it really starts to provide value, I'm clearly prepared to give you even more, right? And so that comes with a contract, which again is a brand contract, not a transactional one, which is why I think this brand and transaction component is really critical.
That is really great advice, and treating that data with the respect that it deserves and adding value is something that we all should be customer first about.
On the data component, this is also an element of what you have to do inside the culture of the company. So with McDonald's, we were just incredibly focused. You called out one of our insights earlier about childhood happiness in adults. We were incredibly focused on building a connection and culture, but everyone was talking about culture. So what's your role in it? For us, we talked about 4 areas. It was food, obviously. So how do you impact food culture? Do you know youth culture? Because that's where you're playing. We actually said data was culture, right? Data is a form of currency. It's a form of language, especially for a younger end of the market, to your point, who are digital first. So do you actually not only understand how to use data, but do you understand it as a language and a currency and a relationship to send the right signals to customers where they say, that's an intimacy of knowledge that I want you to have about me. Thank you. I get it. Versus, why are you sending me an offer for something I just bought? And you're using data that demonstrates you're trying to take advantage of me, but you don't even know who I am, but you actually have the answers, right? That's where I think creepy kicks in.
And you've talked about fan truths.
Yeah.
Fans being an important factor in insights. What are some of your favorite fan truths that you've heard?
So whether it's fan truths at McDonald's or pet parent truths at Petco. I mean, you just hit on one with Petco, right? Which is, the truth around it is it's like having a child. And so I start to do all the things that I was doing when I had my child, whether it's monogramming things or whether it's thinking through the phases, like what you just described is like going to baby center, but you do it for your pet. Where am I in 16 weeks of training, right? McDonald's, I mean, those fan truths ranged from, my wife were here, she would say, the fan truth of if someone says they don't want fries, bring them fries because they're just going to eat yours, right? Because I'm forever saying, no, I don't need fries. Like, stay away from mine, right? There's the fan truth that created the Happy Meal really came out of a tweet that we had posted and the reaction we saw to it. The tweet said something to the effect of, one day you wake up and don't even realize you had your last Happy Meal. And you just got this reaction. Of course you got this reaction. There's this sort of like, oh. So you dive under that and understand that's a childhood loss that I associate with this amazing experience at McDonald's. Well, we know how to do that. So that's where the adult Happy Meal came from. Let's give them that childhood joy. And then once we untapped that and we saw how responsive people were to that, we said, okay, well, again, don't walk away from the strategy. The next one we did was birthdays. And that's where the Grimace craze came from. We didn't know what Grimace's birthday was, but we knew people had this association with either getting invited to the cool kid's birthday party at McDonald's, or my parents, I was never cool enough to have my parents actually do one there. But if you're like, that is like nirvana, right? How do we recreate that? So all we did was use Grimace as that representation of a child. Give them the shake. I wish I could say we plotted the whole TikTok craze that happened with it, but that's not the point. The point is when you create culture and relationship, content creators don't use brands unless there's a relationship that they want to use it for, right? And so that's when the trifecta kicks in of you doing the right thing and creators jumping in and helping you do the next level.
Tariq, you are a true example of an IRG growth leader. I want to end by talking about humanized growth. What does the concept mean to you? What are you looking for in the companies that you work with, in the people that you work with? And how does that all work together to further the agenda of humanized growth?
Yeah, I think when I had my IRG experience, I think the first element of it was just to know that there was such a huge community out there that thought that way, right? Because a lot of us are in community environments where you're developing cultures and you're helping cultures start to learn what the power of humanizing the organization can be. So I think personally and selfishly, when I first started, it was very much like an oxygen for me to develop as a leader. But what was powerful was to see both the soft and the hard science, the soft and the hard numbers of not only the power of what it does for you to develop as an individual, as a leader, but when you also then look at what the growth is for companies that embrace these. And so when you look at the data around those companies that develop around developing their leaders and their culture and their people with a humanized growth mindset, growth being the critical word, that's not just about the individual growth, that's about the business growth. And when you see it and you see the multipliers of companies that practice this and how they outperform, that to me was it became a really powerful way for you to talk about the things that are inherently important to me as an individual, but to do it in a way that the organization can understand the value it had for the company. We still have a lot of work to do, right? Companies haven't fully understood this, but increasingly being able to talk about growth mindset, not only through the lens of the balance sheet and the P&L, but through the P&L of our people and the elements that are important to them and the metrics on their personal P&L. That to me is where I start to look for in the companies that I work with. And certainly as I look towards my next role, it's very much about that mindset and the purpose of not only the company, but then how do you apply that to the work and your people and to the growth of the business.
People P&L. I love that.
I wish I could claim that one completely on my own. I've heard this. There's a great book out there called Red Helicopter. And it's a great story of a great leader who was part of a PE and a fund that had no choice. He saw no choice but to buy this company himself. Female, black-led company. And he went in and looked and reinvented the balance sheet. And he wrote 2 different balance sheets. He wrote one that was literally the one that he legally had to apply. But then he wrote another one. And he talks about if you actually look at goodwill on a balance sheet, goodwill actually isn't goodwill. It's actually it's dealing with the loss. And so he flips it on his head and he actually developed a balance sheet that was around the growth of his people. And so, for example, one of the metrics they started to track was women starting to get pregnant. Because when he first joined, the women were saying, I don't know what's going to happen with this company. I don't know if I can start a family with the stability of this company. And so as he started to see maternity leaves go up, he started to associate that with a comfort and a confidence and a trust in where the company was actually going. And so he started to develop literally an alternative financial model based on the growth of his employees. And so he literally built these 2 systems for how to think about it. And it stayed with me. It's a fantastic read.
Wow. Red Helicopter?
Red Helicopter.
Well, definitely check that out. Well, Tariq, our time is over. The party is winding down, but thank you so much for joining me. It was great to have you. If you want to hear anything more about what we discussed today, it will be in the show notes. And remember, everyone is invited to Opinion Party, so be sure to like and subscribe.
Thanks.
See ya.